Hey yogis, welcome to my channel. My name is Kassandra and I am here in beautiful Puerto Viejo, Costa Rica. I was recently asked what my favorite hip openers were. So if you're trying to increase your hip flexibility, which poses should you focus on? And I mean, yoga has probably hundreds of hip opening yoga poses, but I wanted to keep this simple and narrow it down to my top 5 favorite yoga poses for hip flexibility and mobility. So number 1, first pose, I definitely think every yoga practitioner should be doing on a regular basis if they want to increase their hip flexibility is a wide-legged child's pose. This is a wonderful way to target the inner groin and inner edges of the hips, as well as down a little bit into the inner legs. So the great thing about this pose is that it's really simple, perfect for beginners. You don't need to be very advanced and you don't really need any props either. So you bring your big toes together to touch, and then your knees go as wide as they can, or as wide as is comfortable. So as your flexibility and range of motion increases, you'll be able to open the knees up more and more. Once you have your hips pressing towards your heels, they might be elevated when the hips are tight, that's perfectly fine. But once you have them as far back as you can, then you can reach your arms forward and fold down to the floor. So wide-legged child's pose for me is fairly easy, but it wasn't always that way. So when I was a little bit tighter in my hips, one thing that I like to do is to keep my knees a little bit closer in together. So if the knees are too wide for your range of motion, you'll feel tension and pinching in your low back, which we never ever want. So you're better off bringing your knees a little bit closer. And then what you can do, instead of having your big toes touching, you can just put a block in between your feet and then let your hips sit up on a block. You can even stack a couple of blocks so that you have some support there. And as you reach your arms forward, if you're not completely able to lower down to the mat, having another block under the forehead or under the chest can be one way that you can make the pose a little bit more accessible. Another way to modify and do a wide-legged child's pose differently is to just do it lying down on your back. It's really the same thing. So pulling your knees instead of directly into your belly, you would keep your big toes together, and then you would just widen your knees and try to draw them in towards the armpits and towards the shoulders. So just holding something like this is a really effective way to start to increase the flexibility in your hips and inner groin. Pose number 2 that I think every yogi should be doing on a regular basis. This is my actual all-time favorite yoga pose. I don't go a single day without doing it, and that's asana, low lunge. So this one is great to increase the flexibility in the hip flexors, so more at the front of the hips. And if you suffer from low back issues, if you spend most of your day sitting down, which is, you know, what most of the population really does, low lunges are a great way to help relieve stress in your lower back while also improving your hip flexibility. So this is another one that's super simple and that yogis at any level can practice. From your tabletop pose, you can step your right foot forward to the top of the mat. So the feet and legs are hip width distance apart. You're stacking your right knee over the top of your ankle. Some schools of yoga do say that it's okay to let the knee go forward, especially if you're really open. For some people it works. I'm not really the kind of teacher that says definitely do one thing and definitely don't do something else. We all have different bodies, but for me, I know that it is best if I keep my knee directly over the top of the ankle. And then you're letting your hips press all the way forward and down and just either sinking here. So if it's more of a yin asana, you would not contract your muscles, and you can either keep your fingertips on some blocks directly on the floor, or you can make this more of an active pose by squeezing and hugging the legs into the midline, lifting up a little bit higher. And what we want to avoid is this deep curve in the lower back. So you're lengthening the tailbone down slightly, drawing the low belly in, and from here, moving to press the hips forward and down. So just because I could sink my hips a lot lower does not necessarily mean that I want to. I actually find that I get a better stretch if I lift myself up a little bit and really work the core from here and maintain the integrity. And you should be able to feel a really great, nice deep stretch in the front of your left thigh. So super nice, great for all levels, and you can use some blocks if you need to. If you need to modify for any reason, so for a lot of people this is difficult on the knees, of course you can pad your knees, but an alternative that's fairly similar is to do it reclined pulling your knee into your chest, or even taking your half happy baby pose. So if you look at the way my legs look right now, it's a very similar shape that I'm creating, and you will get a little bit into the hip flexors, but I definitely prefer low lunge to this option. Third pose is lizard, and there are a couple of different ways to do them. So some variations of lizard pose target the inside of the groin, others will go more towards the outer hip and into the glute, which is the one that I kind of prefer the most and want to show you today. Similar to your low lunge, except that we're not stepping the foot forward in between the palms. We're going to step the right leg to the outer edge of your hand. So the feet are a little bit wider. Both palms are to the inside of that leg. So option one in lizard is to do it more like a low lunge, keeping your knee over the front second and third toe, knee over the ankle, holding from here, and maybe even lowering down onto your forearms or onto a block if flexibility permits it. My favorite way to do a lizard pose is by flexing the front foot and then rolling to the outer edge, so the blade of that foot. So the sole of my right foot is no longer touching the mat. I'm really rolling to the outer edge. What's important is that I'm flexing at the ankle here so that my hip, my knee, my ankle, they are all rotating the same degree. This is where people get in trouble with their knees. Their hips and their ankles are doing one thing, but the knee is doing a complete opposite thing, and then we wonder why we have knee pain. So it's super important that you keep flexed here, and then you're pressing the hips forward and down. You should feel a really great stretch in the outer hip, and then you can lower down on your forearms, on your blocks, or just all the way down to the mat. Really, really, really great stretch. And you can even add on to this one by taking a quad stretch by bending into your back knee and pulling it in. And this is a pretty intense hip opening asana. Pose number 4 is one I am sure most of you are very familiar with, and this is pigeon pose, or what we call swan pose in yin yoga. So I'll show you 2 different ways that you can do pigeon depending on your level of flexibility. Let's start with the traditional variation of pigeon pose, the one that you've probably seen the most often. So from tabletop pose, you'd be bringing your right knee behind your right wrist. Now, students immediately usually ask me, do I keep my heel in close, or am I trying to get my foot over towards your left hand? And the answer is, it depends. For me, my hips are open, so it's no problem for me to get my shin parallel to the top of the mat and then just slide my left hip back and hold the pose here. However, for a lot of people, if the hip is not really open enough, or if you've had some tears, ligament tears in your knee, this might not be appropriate for you, which means that you would keep your heel close to the groin and work your pigeon pose from here. So if I turn, just to give you a different angle, option 1, so the one that I normally do is I get my shin parallel to the front of the mat. I level out my hips, and I can either hold here and fold, or another option when you're just kind of working your way in is to keep the heel in close and then work the pigeon pose from here and fold it down. So let me come back to the top of the mat. One thing that I'd like to point out that happens often in pigeon pose, when your hips are tight, usually the hips will not be touching the mat, which is totally normal, don't worry about it. However, I find that when that happens, it's a lot easier if you just grab a block and prop yourself up on a block. So you're kind of closing the gap between your hips and the floor. That way you can maintain your integrity in the pelvis. Another thing that tends to happen is that we're going to roll over onto the glute and onto the hip of that bent knee. If my right leg is forward, I want to keep the weight and keep some grounding action into that left hip. So everything is facing the front of my mat, and then I can fold it down. If you have any kind of hip, knee, ankle, or even low back injuries, or if the range of motion just isn't there yet, pigeon pose might not work for you, so you can do reclined pigeon instead. Some people call this eye of the needle. So reclined pigeon, feet are flat on the mat, knees are bent. And you're just crossing your right ankle over the top of your left knee. Again, I'm flexing my right foot because I'm trying to protect my knee. Hip, knee, and ankle are all doing the same thing. This might be enough, or you can reach through with your arms, either hold on to the back of the hamstrings or the front of the shin, and then pull it in. Honestly, it is the exact same stretch deep into the glutes and deep into the outer hip, just like your pigeon pose, except that there's way less stress on your joints. You can also just prop your left leg and left foot up on against the wall so that you don't even need to use your arms, or you can even do the same thing with a block. So if I put my left leg, I can just elevate it a little bit on a block, and then the upper body can relax, so you can make this a bit more of a passive pose. Pigeon is amazing at increasing your hip flexibility. Pose number 5 is a standing pose, and it's warrior 2. So warrior 2 is nice and simple. Right foot forward, left foot back. If I have my right toes pointing to the top of my mat, I want my left foot to be parallel to the shorter edge of my mat. This is true for most students. Some students will find that it feels better if they have their back foot turned in. And then my front heel is aligned to the middle of my back arch, and then you bend into your front knee. Arms go out. So warrior 2, probably a pose that you're really familiar with, but this is one of the best ways that you can increase your hip flexibility, but also really maintain the integrity in the joints. So if you're only ever focusing on stretching and improving the mobility in your joints, you can also lead your way into some injuries. So we also want to practice some poses that require us to really properly engage the muscles around our joints so that we can stay really healthy this way and just find some balance in our practice. So if my arms are out, I'm bending into my front right knee. I'm trying to squeeze into my glutes to push that right knee open. What tends to happen with students in warrior 2 is that the right knee collapses inwards towards the big toe. Remember, hip, knee, ankle, always in the same line, always doing the same thing. So if my hip is open, my knee is going to push open, and it's going to drive directly over that second and third toe so that I'm directly over my ankle, knee directly over the ankle. Another thing that tends to happen in warrior 2 is that it feels like the feet are pushing away from each other. Instead, think of squeezing and hugging into the midline. A tiny little bit of a micro bend in your back knee is a great idea as well. So holding your warrior 2 is awesome. If you wanted to make it even harder, you can do humble warrior, where you dive to the inside of that right leg. So really getting deep into that hamstring, or sorry, deep into that hip. If you wanted to make it harder still, one pose that I do in my Hips Don't Lie video here on YouTube, for example, is to walk the hands towards the center of the mat, and then I would use my right hand to actually push that right knee open. So this one is a little bit more passive, a little bit less active. It is a super, super deep stretch, probably not appropriate for beginners. Beginners just stick to your regular warrior 2, but if you feel like you want to amp it up, just lower down and use your hand to push the knee open wider, and you are definitely going to feel it. So that's it, yogis. Those are my top 5 favorite hip opening yoga poses. But like I mentioned at the beginning of class, there are, dozens and dozens and dozens of others that you can do in your yoga practice to increase hip flexibility. Things like fire log pose, or knee pile, gomukhasana, malasana, frog pose. These are all amazing, happy baby, all great to open up your hips. But I find that if you just stick with these basic first 5 and you practice them regularly and consistently, you should really start to see a difference in the mobility and also the integrity of the pelvis and integrity of the hip joint. So hip joint, if you think about it, it's a ball and socket, right? So we don't only want to focus on opening the outer edge of the hip, we also want to remember to go to the inner edge as well as the front of the hip, which is why we do some lunges, some pigeon poses, child's pose, all of that. So we're really tackling the whole thing from all corners. Let me know in the comments down below what your favorite hip opening yoga pose is, or if you plan on practicing any of these more consistently on a regular basis to increase your hip flexibility. If you don't already, please do subscribe to my channel. It's a wonderful way to support free yoga on the internet. And that's it for me today. Thanks so much for watching. Namaste.